A black honors student steps off a plane. Minutes later, TSA tackles him for matching a suspect's math skills. Cameras roll. He's cuffed crying, holding nothing but his valedictorian speech. The footage goes viral, but what no one knows is why he was really targeted. Because what he solved wasn't just an equation, it was a secret he was never meant to see. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The bell echoed through the beige hallways of Fairmont High, a mid-tier public school just outside Raleigh, North Carolina. Students shuffled from classroom to classroom with earbuds in, eyes down, minds elsewhere. It was a school like any other in America, paint chipping off locker doors, posters about SET prep fading under fluorescent lights, and teachers measuring success by standardized test curves, rather than human potential. Cale Richardson was not part of anyone's curve. He sat in the second row of Mrs. Hanley's Algebra 2 class every morning. Always early. Always quiet. His notebooks were filled with layers of calculations, so advanced that even Hanley sometimes paused when collecting his work. But she never said anything aloud. Just a tight nod, maybe a scribbled "great work" at the bottom, more out of obligation than recognition. Cale didn't mind, or at least he told himself he didn't. He was used to being invisible. He wasn't just quiet, he disappeared into the background, like a watermark on paper. Teachers praised the talkative students, the loud thinkers, the eager question askers. Cale wasn't any of those. He was deliberate, precise. Quiet brilliance made people uncomfortable, especially when it came in a black teenage boy wrapped in oversized hoodies and thrifted jeans. Even in lunchrooms buzzing with gossip and TikTok debates, Cale was a blur. He sat alone at the edge of tables, never initiating, rarely responding unless directly addressed. His silence wasn't awkward, it was armor, and though no one saw it, he noticed everything. Numbers weren't just numbers to Cale, they were language. He saw patterns in cafeteria seating arrangements, probability in vending machine selections, algorithms in hallway movement, where others saw random noise. Cale saw code. He spent his nights on forums he never mentioned at school, places where prodigies posted proofs and counterproofs, where MIT freshmen argued over linear algebra, and Cale, under the username Ghost Function, corrected them silently. He never boasted, never once told a soul what he was capable of, because deep down he understood what that would mean. The world wasn't kind to boys like him. Not when they were smarter than the system meant for them. Not when their brilliance contradicted stereotypes sold so deeply it echoed through generations. At home, his mother Regina worked 2 jobs, day shifts at a community center and night cleaning offices downtown. Her hands were calloused from years of labor, but her heart beat with quiet pride. She always told Cale, "You don't have to shine loud to burn bright." Still, she worried, not because she didn't believe in her son, but because she knew the world outside didn't believe in boys like him. One night, while Regina was at work, Cale sat cross-legged on his bedroom floor, surrounded by whiteboards covered in problems he'd crafted himself. He created mathematical paradoxes for fun, testing the limits of logic just to feel something shift in his mind. He never sought validation, but sometimes he imagined what it would feel like if just one teacher asked how he solved things so fast, or if one student said, "Man, how did you do that?" But those moments never came. Not even when Cale solved the school's yearly math challenge in 12 minutes, a problem written for seniors meant to take a full class period. The teacher, Mr. Bellinger, just looked at him, blinked twice, and said, "All right then," before walking away like it hadn't happened. The class barely noticed. Some whispered lucky guess under their breath. Others didn't look up at all. Cale kept the sheet anyway, folded neatly in his backpack. Proof. Not of the solution, but of the silence it met. By junior year, the isolation wasn't new. It had calcified. The school guidance counselor called him in twice to ask if he wanted to join any clubs. He declined politely both times, not because he didn't want connection, but because he didn't want to force his way into spaces that had already decided he didn't belong. Then came the day of the airport layover. Regina had finally saved enough for a mother-son trip, a rare 3-day getaway to New York City. Cale didn't show it, but he was excited. Museums, libraries, that towering skyline. It felt like a reset, even if temporary, but their connecting flight got delayed in Raleigh due to storms up north, and they found themselves stuck in the airport terminal for hours. Cale wandered to a quieter corner near a Dunkin' stand, solving his Rubik's Cube, not once, but 5 times, each rotation faster than the last. A man watched from 2 rows behind him, arms crossed, eyes sharp. He was tall, thin, maybe late 40s, with a pressed navy blazer and a kind of arrogant calm that came from years of being listened to. His name was Professor Alistair Grange, a visiting academic from Oxford University. He had just finished a lecture at Duke, titled Innate Intelligence, Tracing Cognitive Gifts Across Civilizations. He believed brilliance had a lineage, that intelligence was inherited, and heavily influenced by environment. Translation: he didn't expect brilliance from kids like Kale, but watching the cube twist and resolve in Kale's hands, Alistair raised an eyebrow, then reached into his carry-on. Inside was a folded paper, a problem, one he had crafted specifically for his graduate students. A puzzle even the most gifted among them failed to solve in under 3 minutes. He never showed it to undergraduates, and certainly never to children. But this wasn't about intellectual curiosity. It was about putting someone in their place. He approached Kale slowly, paper in hand, tone laced with false charm. "Fancy a little challenge just for fun?" Kale looked up. He didn't smile, didn't flinch, just reached out and took the paper with quiet curiosity. And in the next 20 seconds, the silence around them would shift. Forever. That was about to change the moment a British academic boarded a flight with a chip on his shoulder and a problem in his pocket. The airport terminal buzzed with scattered conversations, rolling luggage, and the occasional announcement about delays echoing from worn-out speakers. But to Professor Alistair Grange, none of it mattered. His mind was already occupied, irritated, actually, by what he considered an unavoidable detour in his otherwise meticulously scheduled speaking tour. He had been en route to Washington, D.C. for a keynote lecture, when storms forced his plane to land in Raleigh. The inconvenience gnawed at him. He disliked anything that disrupted his sense of intellectual importance. He had spent the last week giving talks across major universities, each filled with academics praising his newest theories on what he called cognitive hierarchies among global youth. Dressed sharply in tailored suits, he commanded rooms with a gentle aristocratic cadence. Students adored him, peers envied him, institutions sought him. Behind his polished exterior, however, lay a worldview shaped by generations of elitism, one where brilliance belonged to certain histories, certain families, certain cultures. His culture, his history, his lineage. He often claimed objectivity in public conversations about aptitude, but privately, he believed genius followed predictable trajectories aligned with privilege, pedigree, and the right kind of education. He didn't say it aloud, but he carried assumptions about who could achieve greatness and who could only imitate it. And in his mind, that divide was clear. He adjusted his blazer as he settled into an airport lounge seat, mentally rehearsing the lecture he planned to give in D.C. He intended to make a point about environmental limitations affecting youth in underserved communities. His examples usually trailed toward black and brown neighborhoods, which he framed as chronically disadvantaged, rarely exceptional. It wasn't hatred, he told himself, just statistics, data, patterns. That was when he noticed movement a few seats ahead. A boy, 16, maybe 17, sitting cross-legged on the carpet, with a Rubik's Cube in hand, not just solving it, but turning it with a speed that bordered on impossible. Alistair's gaze sharpened. Then the cube shifted again, with the boy's eyes closed. The motions were fluid, precise, almost mechanical. When the cube snapped back into its perfect pattern, the boy opened his eyes with the same calm indifference he'd shown before closing them. Alistair blinked. One moment of surprise flickered through him, followed by something else, a tightening in his chest he refused to name. He watched the boy repeat the activity, solving the cube again in seconds. Then again, the efficiency, the rhythm, the unbroken concentration. It all unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He studied the boy's clothing. A hoodie, worn jeans, a simple backpack. He wasn't accompanied by tutors or parents. No team hoodie from a competitive math league. Nothing indicating elite training. He looked like any black teen waiting out a delay, and yet what Alistair saw contradicted everything he'd long believed. A quiet brilliance that didn't align with his assumptions. He straightened in his seat, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose. For a moment he wondered if the boy was performing a trick, some rehearsed pattern, some memorized sequence. But then he caught sight of a stack of scribbled papers beside the boy, covered in equations, partial derivatives, and proofs that looked like the inner workings of a young mind living far ahead of its time. He found himself leaning forward. He didn't like being wrong. The boy, unaware he was being observed, picked up one sheet and began writing casually, as though his mind were simply stretching its legs. His pencil glided across the page with the ease of someone who wasn't performing but thinking. Thinking deeply, freely. Alistair exhaled sharply through his nose. There had to be an explanation. Maybe the boy had been coached by some elite program. Perhaps he was imitating formulas he didn't fully understand. Or maybe this was one of those extremely rare anomalies that academia whispered about, but rarely encountered in real life. Impossible, he muttered under his breath. Raw talent without structure rarely sustains itself. Yet here it was, staring him in the face. Driven partly by curiosity, and partly by the need to reassert intellectual authority. Alistair stood up. His shoes clicked sharply against the polished airport tiles. He adjusted the cuffs of his blazer, a habit he performed whenever preparing to make an impression, and walked toward the boy with the confident gait of someone accustomed to being listened to. As he approached, he rehearsed the polished tone he'd use. Something friendly on the surface, something patronizing underneath, something that allowed him to test the boy without appearing threatened. Because that was the truth he refused to articulate. He felt threatened. "Impressive toy you've got there," he said, his British accent cutting through the ambient airport noise. The boy Cale looked up slowly. His eyes were calm, unbothered. He didn't respond immediately, only set the Rubik's Cube down, with a soft click. His silence wasn't rude. It was measured, as if he were waiting for Alistair to reveal his intention. Alistair smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You seem rather good with patterns," he continued. "Quite unusual. Most children your age don't process information that quickly." "Most don't try," Cale answered quietly. Alistair's smile stiffened. He cleared his throat, pretending the answer hadn't caught him off guard. He'd expected shyness, timidity, gratitude for the attention. Instead, he found himself looking at a boy who spoke plainly, unshaken by condescension. "May I?" Alistair gestured toward the pages beside Cale. Cale gave a subtle nod. Alistair lifted the top sheet. His eyebrows shot up before he managed to suppress the reaction. These weren't copied formulas. They weren't scribbles. They were original patterns, unique derivations with logical consistency. He turned the page over, then another. The equations weren't perfect, but they were imaginative, bold, the kind of work that suggested intuition rather than training. He didn't want to admit it, but what he held was remarkable. Still, he clung to his bias like a lifeline. "Interesting attempts," he said, masking tension with professorly aloofness. "But creativity without discipline doesn't amount to much." Cale didn't react. He simply reached for another sheet and continued writing, unfazed by the comment. That indifference struck Alistair more deeply than any argument would have. He wasn't used to being dismissed, especially not by someone so young. A small pulse of irritation throbbed at his temple. He needed to reassert control of the moment. He needed to prove that the academic world he represented was still the pinnacle, still untouchable, still above whatever anomaly sat before him. "Tell me," he said, stepping closer, "have you ever tried a real mathematical challenge?" Cale looked up again, his expression unreadable. "What do you mean by real?" Alistair inhaled sharply. There it was. The kind of subtle defiance that pricked at his ego. He'd come too far to walk away. If this boy truly thought he was operating on a higher level, then Alistair would let him attempt something that had humbled minds far more trained. He reached into his leather carry-on. Folded carefully inside was a single sheet of paper, a problem he had written for doctoral candidates during one of his seminars, a challenge that straddled the line between art and intellect, something elegant, complicated, and notoriously unsolvable in under several minutes, even by adults dedicated to the field. He had never shown it to a teenager, but this was no longer about curiosity. It was about putting the world back into an order that made sense to him. He held the folded paper between two fingers, allowing the moment to stretch. His smirk returned, controlled, confident, and tinged with something darker. Alistair smirked, and pulled out a problem he had written for doctoral students, one even they struggled to crack. The air in the terminal changed the moment Alistair extended the folded paper toward Cale. To the professor, it was a subtle test, a calculated display of control masked as curiosity. His voice came laced with a performative casualness. "Just for fun," he said, but there was nothing light in his tone. Beneath his British charm sat centuries of quiet condescension. To him, this was not a game. It was a restoration of order. Cale accepted the paper without flinching. His eyes met Alistair's just long enough to measure intention. then dropped calmly to the page. He unfolded it with a delicate grace, not with anticipation or anxiety, but with the cool observation of someone studying an unremarkable object. The problem sprawled across the sheet, dense, complex, layered with recursive traps and red herrings. It was designed to humble. Alistair had written it specifically for graduate seminars, where even his brightest doctoral students took long minutes just to understand its shape. Cale glanced once, then again. His eyes shifted, not scanning, but absorbing, like a pianist glancing at a familiar composition. He didn't bite his lip. He didn't tense. He simply saw it. The pencil in his hand lifted, and with unbothered fluidity, he began to write. The room didn't notice immediately. But Alistair did. One line. Two. A fold in logic. A simplification. A correction. Cale's pencil moved like water over a surface it had touched before. He wasn't wrestling with the problem. He was unwinding it, gently, like untangling headphones, and then with a single clean mark across the bottom corner, it was done. He placed the pencil down. 20 seconds. The silence spread like ink across paper. Nearby travelers paused. A woman in a pantsuit stopped scrolling on her phone. A teenager looked up mid-sip from his smoothie. Even a young child stopped whining. There was a sense, barely perceptible at first, that something unordinary had occurred. Cale lifted the page, and without a trace of pride or performance, held it toward Alistair. Here, he said, his voice calm, almost neutral. Alistair didn't reach for it right away. A tightness curled in his chest, one he hadn't felt since his earliest days in academia. The quiet horror of being wrong. When he finally took the paper and examined the steps, his breath caught. The logic was intact. The transitions were seamless. The trick sections, the misleading paths, Cale had stepped over them like puddles on a sidewalk. No hesitation, no missteps. He hadn't solved the problem. He'd dismantled it. Did you memorize this from somewhere? Alistair asked, tone sharp with disbelief, though he tried to cloak it in curiosity. No, Cale replied, voice soft. It's just patterns. Alistair bristled. This isn't pattern recognition. It's multi-layered logic. It repeats. Cale interrupted gently, his tone devoid of arrogance. Just in different clothing. The simplicity of the reply landed like a slap. The boy wasn't trying to impress. He was explaining what he saw. That, somehow, made it worse. A small crowd had begun to gather. Someone whispered, "Is he solving something that guy gave him?" Another said, "That's the Oxford professor, right?" Alistair cleared his throat and stepped back, trying to retake control. While the exercise was theoretical, designed more to provoke curiosity than he didn't misunderstand anything, a woman's voice called out. She held up her phone, recording. Others turned toward her. Another man added, "That kid solved it like it was nothing." Cale remained seated. He didn't gloat, didn't smile. He simply picked up his Rubik's Cube again and started to twist, as if the interruption was over, as if the world hadn't just tipped. Alistair stood frozen, reeling inwardly. His theories, his structures, his internalized metrics of who belonged where, it all collapsed in front of him. And worse, it collapsed in public. He'd expected to humble a teenager. Instead, the moment had humiliated him. Then came a voice from across the terminal. A girl in a bright jacket, standing near a coffee cart, lifted her phone and said to her friend loud enough for all to hear, "This is going viral. I've been recording the whole thing." Alistair's heart dropped. The camera wasn't just on Cale. It was on him. His face, his expression, his discomfort. The moment he lost control, the moment his bias became visible. The girl tapped her screen and typed a caption in seconds. Her thumb hovered for a moment, then hit upload. The post went live with 6 words that would spiral far beyond this airport terminal. Black kid schools. Oxford professor. In that instant, it no longer mattered what Alistair had meant by just for fun. Because now the world was watching. One bystander recorded the entire moment and uploaded it to social media with the caption "Black Kid Schools Oxford Professor." The terminal video didn't just go viral, it detonated. By the time Cale and his mother boarded their delayed flight, the clip had already racked up over 600,000 views. By the time they landed in New York, it crossed 2 million. And by morning, the internet had turned a quiet moment of mathematical brilliance into a cultural fault line. It started on TikTok. The caption, "Black Kid Schools Oxford Professor," struck a nerve. Algorithms ate it like wildfire devours dry grass. It hit the For You page like a sledgehammer. People paused mid-scroll, replayed it, shared it, commented, dissected it. YouTubers downloaded the footage, repackaged it with commentary, slowed it down, added dramatic music. On Twitter, the clip turned into a rallying cry, shared with hashtags like Math Genius, Black Excellence, and Oxford Silence. But it didn't take long for admiration to turn sideways. The internet didn't know Kale. That meant they could shape him, build him up, break him down, remold him into something digestible, something they could own. First came the praise. This kid needs to be at MIT. Why isn't he already in college? This is what happens when talent gets ignored because of skin color. Regina, Kale's mother, saw the clip for the first time that afternoon. She froze, phone trembling in her hand. At first she smiled, small, tight, proud, but the comment section chilled her almost immediately. Staged. No way a kid from a public school is solving Oxford-level math. This feels fake. Where's the proof that problem was real? Then it turned uglier. Probably memorized it. He's just parroting formulas. This is why real genius is getting devalued. Some comments didn't bother with subtlety. Affirmative action prodigy. They always find a way to fake intelligence now. This is why you can't trust social media. Regina wanted to comment, to defend him. But Kale stopped her. It'll only make it worse, he said quietly. He was seated on their hotel bed, phone off, laptop closed. He hadn't read the comments himself, but he didn't have to. He knew how the world worked. He had seen it before on a smaller scale. Black kids called cheaters when they tested too high, labeled suspicious for asking advanced questions, pulled aside by teachers, told to show their work even when the answers were right. But this was different. This was millions of people watching his face, picking it apart, deciding what kind of genius he was allowed to be. The following day, Regina received emails from news outlets, education platforms, even talk shows. Everyone wanted a piece of Kale. A few called him a role model for black youth. Others asked for interviews, 10 minutes just to discuss your son's unique mind. One network even sent over a draft contract to license the airport footage. Kale declined all of it. "I'm not a story," he said. "I was just solving something." But they wouldn't let it go. At school, everything shifted. On Monday, the hallways were quieter than usual. Students stared longer. Some nodded at Kale as if acknowledging his sudden status. But there was a weirdness to it. Like they didn't know what to say, or worse, like they assumed he'd changed. His math teacher, Mr. Bellinger, handed him a test with trembling fingers. I suppose this will be too easy for you," he mumbled with an awkward laugh. Kale didn't answer. In the cafeteria, someone whispered, "That's him." Another student filmed him eating. A third tried to sit near him and asked, "So, like, are you famous now?" before taking a selfie without asking. None of it felt good. None of it felt safe. By Tuesday, the tone online shifted again. One video stitched Kale's airport moment with a breakdown of the math problem. But the narrator claimed the problem wasn't Oxford level at all. "It's exaggerated," he said confidently. "This is a publicity stunt to push some woke narrative." That phrase, woke narrative, was all it took. The trolls poured in like floodwater. Kale's school account was flooded with messages. Some supportive, others venomous. Anonymous Reddit threads dissected his facial expressions, his clothing, his speech cadence, his body language. One post asked, "Why is it always the quiet ones suddenly becoming overnight heroes?" The implication was loud and clear. He hadn't earned the moment. He had taken something that didn't belong to him. At lunch on Wednesday, someone slipped a folded note into his backpack. He found it later, after last period. In rough block letters, it read, "Oxford got played. You won't get far." No name. No handwriting match. Just quiet hate, delivered the old-fashioned way. Kale didn't cry. He didn't react. He simply closed his locker and walked home in silence. But Regina noticed. She always did. That night she made Kale his favorite mashed sweet potatoes and grilled chicken, soft music playing in the background. When she sat across from him, she reached for his hand. "You know you didn't do anything wrong, right?" she said gently. Kale nodded. "I know." But his voice sounded far away. Regina squeezed his fingers. "Then why does it feel like we lost something?" Kale didn't answer. The following morning, his principal called him over the intercom. "Kale Richardson, please report to the main office." He moved through the hallways with practiced calm, but students leaned against lockers, watching, Some raised eyebrows. Others smirked. By the time he reached the office, the secretary avoided his eyes. Inside, Principal Mendez stood behind his desk, arms crossed tightly. "We have guests," he said flatly. Two men sat across from him, mid-40s, both in tailored gray suits. Their posture was perfect. Their smiles were hollow. One had a thick leather binder. The other had nothing at all. Cale Mendez said slowly, "These gentlemen would like to speak to you privately." Cale's stomach tightened. Neither man introduced himself. They simply gestured to the seat between them. "We're from a federal program," the one on the left began. "STEM outreach. Nothing to worry about. We've just been following your story, and we'd like to ask a few questions." Cale sat down slowly. Regina wasn't there. No one had informed her. No lawyer, no counselor, just two men in suits with blank eyes, and a folder full of questions they had no right to ask. Cale's school principal summoned him for an urgent conversation with two men in suits waiting quietly in the office. Cale Richardson sat in a too small, too bright office, just off the main corridor of the suburban high school. The hum of fluorescent lights overhead sounded hollow. Across the cheap laminated table from him were two men in dark suits. Not his teachers, not school administrators, but strangers whose presence felt wrong, invasive. Their eyes didn't flick to the walls, nor to the framed Student of the Month certificates that hung behind him. They stared only at Cale, as though he were a specimen behind glass. The room was silent, taut with expectation. The taller man cleared his throat. He spoke calmly, politely. "Cale Richardson, you did something remarkable the other day. Solved a complex mathematical problem, meant for doctoral candidates. That sort of talent. It's rare." Cale looked at him. Expression neutral. He wasn't frightened yet. Just tired. Tired of being invisible. He nodded once. "I just solved the problem," he said quietly. "Like I always do." The second man, shorter, with thinning hair and a watch that gleamed under the lights, slid a folder across the table. "We believe you didn't just solve it," he said. "We want to know how." Cale's pulse fluttered. The folder had his name on it, typed neatly in the corner. Richardson, Cale. Assessment, priority high. But he didn't feel special. Not really. He felt exposed. The tall man leaned forward, voice softer now. "We'd like to learn more about you, Cale. Your background, your influences. Where do you learn math like that? Who showed you? Who taught you?" Cale hesitated. The question felt wrong. Math was never taught in flashy lessons, or pointed out in bright neon lights. It had lived in his head, quiet, organic. But when the second man pressed, Cale felt the weight of thousands of unseen eyes suddenly on him. "Just me," Cale said after a moment, voice even but firm. "I taught myself. I always loved numbers. They make sense when the world doesn't." A flicker of something, surprise, or perhaps doubt, passed across the shorter man's face. He cleared his throat again. In one swift motion, the folder flipped open. Inside was a printout. A timeline of Cale's online activity, pages and pages of code. Math forum usernames, chat logs, names he barely remembered logging in with. Private messages praising his quick solutions, screenshots of solved problems. The dossier was thick. The taller man tapped the folder. "We'd like access to everything. Your social media, your chat logs, your school history, all of it." Cale felt a cold sweat form on the back of his neck. "Why?" he asked. All this is private. Why does it matter?" The room's air shifted. The fluorescent buzz seemed louder. The shorter man's lips flattened. "Because brilliance, unmonitored brilliance, can be dangerous." Cale barely understood. Dangerous. Him. But he recognized the tone, condescension wrapped in polite language. A tone he'd heard before in classrooms where he was overlooked, dismissed. This time, though, it wasn't a brush-off. It was a demand. He opened his mouth to refuse. But the taller man cut him off gently. "Don't think of this as punishment. Think of it as opportunity. We want to offer you support, funding, mentorship, resources. But with support comes oversight. Are you willing to be part of something bigger than high school, bigger than Raleigh?" Cale raised his eyes. Through the window behind the men came pale daylight, winter afternoon gloom. He thought of late nights hunched over scribbled math problems in his small bedroom, of dusty library tables, of classmates who ignored him, of teachers who never called his name. An offer of recognition felt surreal, but it came with strings. He hesitated, then said nothing. He didn't commit. The two men sat back. Their eyes were polite, professional, but Cale felt exposed, vulnerable, as though his mind, once private, was now scanned, logged, sorted. Silence stretched. Then the taller man closed the folder. In soft, final tones he said, "Very well. Consider this an invitation, or a chance." He stood. The shorter man gathered his papers. They didn't offer smiles. They didn't say, "We'll be in touch." Nothing so courteous. Instead, the taller man nodded once and left the room. When the door clicked shut, the second man lingered for a moment. Then he turned to Cale, locked eyes, almost gently. "We'll watch," he said, "even when you don't see us." And then he left too. Cale sat alone for a long minute, stunned. The dull light above seemed to press down on him. He exhaled slowly. The folder was gone now, but the sense of being watched stayed. He rose and walked toward the door, toward what should have been freedom. But in the hallway he froze. A quiet voice called out, soft but knowing, "Cale." He turned. Two janitors stood nearby, mops in hand, buckets at their feet. One nodded politely, brows furrowed for a split second, just enough for Cale to see suspicion, wariness. Neither dared meet his eyes. The absurdity, he felt like he'd shattered a secret code, and the halls were suddenly listening. Cale stepped forward, wanting to back away, but his feet felt heavy. He looked at the closed door to the office, then at the empty hallway beyond. Every light, every tile, everything made him feel observed. He hurried away, weaving through empty corridors, past trophies, banners, untouched lockers, until he reached the stairwell. He descended slowly, each step hollow under his feet. The walls pressed in, shadows pooled. By the time he exited the building, the afternoon sun had sharpened, casting long, unwelcome shadows across campus. Outside, the world looked the same. Students laughed, joked, carried backpacks, but nothing looked the same to Cale. He felt different, seen, exposed. That night, at home, he couldn't sleep. His mind churned with images of the folder, the dossiers, the men watching him as though he were a problem waiting to be solved. He paced the small living room, the glow from the street lamp outside casting shifting patterns across the old wallpaper. He heard the front door open quietly. His mother, Regina, stepped in. She hung her coat, then paused, the way she always did when something weighed on her heart. She studied him for a long moment, eyes narrowed not in anger but in worry. Regina knew him better than anyone. She sensed the tension, the fear. "Cale," she asked quietly, "what happened today?" He didn't answer. He just sat down, faced the floor. The light from the street lamp flickered over his face and cast long shadows under his eyes. He looked small, fragile, or maybe just lost. Regina's shoulders slumped, and she came to sit next to him. She reached out, placed her hand over his. She asked again, softer this time, "Did someone make you feel like you can't breathe?" No words came. For a moment, only the hum of the house, the distant sound of traffic. Then Cale shook his head, finally spoke, voice rough. "They want to watch me," he said. "Track me, treat me, like I don't know. Like I could disappear if I prove too smart." Regina squeezed his hand. She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, the light looked different. Older, sharper. She rose, grabbed her coat, and said, "Get some rest. Don't answer anything. Not until we talk." Cale watched her go, but sleep didn't come. Instead, his mind replayed every second in that office. The dossier, the invitation, the threat. "We'll watch," the man had said. That phrase played on loop. Later that week, whispers started. In the hallway, in the cafeteria. Students looked at Cale differently. Some nodded at him, awkwardly. Others avoided his eyes. He saw phones casually pointing when he passed. He felt eyes tracking his steps. The world blurred between friendly curiosity and invasive scrutiny. At home, Regina spent hours on her laptop. She researched, called old acquaintances, combed through public records. She pieced together patterns, letters of recommendations for gifted youth, recruitment forms, legal disclaimers, thinly disguised as volunteer intake. Every sign pointed the same direction. This wasn't mentorship. It was surveillance, control. Late one night, Regina came to Cale's room. She closed the door softly, sat on the edge of his bed. She looked at him, really looked at him, not like a student or a candidate, but like her son. Her eyes glinted with anger. a fierce light. Kale, she said, voice low, determined. No one, I don't care who they are, treats my child like property. Not on my watch. Kale listened. He felt warmth, for the first time in days. But fear hovered beneath it. What if rejecting them meant more pressure, more danger? Regina seemed to sense the fear, but she didn't back down. Instead, she stood, moved to the window, pulled the curtain back halfway. Outside, the night sky was weirdly calm, as if nothing had changed. She turned, looked at him hard. If they come knocking again, you don't answer. Not until I decide what we do. Keel nodded, uncertain. He didn't know what she planned, but he believed her. In her anger, in her protectiveness, in that blazing refusal. Days passed, no calls, no messages, but the weight remained. Kale watched the street outside his window. Every passing car made him flinch. Every siren felt personal. He stopped going to math club meetings. He avoided eye contact at school. He tried to be invisible again, but invisibility felt like rust eating him from the inside. And then, one evening, as rain hammered the windows and thunder rolled in the distance, a file arrived under their doormat. No envelope, no name, just a plain black folder, stark and heavy. Regina picked it up with trembling hands, flipped it open under the kitchen light. The pages inside were typed, neat, but the contents hit her like a punch. A list of names. Not just Kale's. Hundreds. Young black students, math prodigies, science whizzes, talented musicians, all labeled priority, exceptional. Next to each name, dates, aliases, school districts, coded notes, monitor, guide, contain. Her heart pounded. She looked at Kale. He stood frozen, staring at the list. Recognition dawned in his eyes. Not hope, but horror. That's not mentorship, Regina whispered, voice steady but low. It's containment. Keel swallowed. The folder felt like a shackle. He'd been right to fear. They weren't visitors. They were watchers. The thunder outside cracked. The windows rattled. The rain tapped jagged rhythms against the glass. Regina slammed the folder shut. Her hand left a faint imprint on the cover. And in that moment, Kale understood. They weren't offering him a chance. They were marking him. And they expected him to carry that mark. Before he could speak, Regina turned toward the front door. Her face was pale, but unwavering. There was something fierce in her eyes, a fire he'd only seen once before, years ago, when she fought for him on his first day of school, after kids mocked his accent. That fire was burning again. She walked toward the door. She opened it slowly, then paused, looked back at Kale. Her voice was soft, but carried weight. If they come again, we don't just hide. Kale's blood ran cold. He knew they might come. Tonight, tomorrow, or when he least expected it. But before the door closed, there was a knock. One sharp, deliberate rap on the wood. Kale's head snapped up. Regina froze. The sound echoed. Outside, the darkness pressed against the glass. The folder still lay on the table. A warning, a threat, a truth. And on the other side of the door, footsteps. Kale's mother, Regina, arrived mid-interrogation and unleashed fury that would later make headlines across the nation. The clip wasn't long, just 1 minute and 42 seconds, but it struck with the force of thunder. Regina Richardson, standing in a school office, her hand clenched around her son's shoulder, stared down 2 federal agents and asked the question no one else had. Why is black brilliance always treated as suspicion before celebration? The words hit like a punch to the ribs, not just because of how she said them, but because of who she was, an exhausted, determined mother, whose voice shook with love and fury. In that moment, she wasn't just speaking for Kale, she was speaking for every child who had ever been questioned instead of congratulated. The secretary who filmed it hadn't meant to start a fire, but when her niece uploaded the video to Twitter, it caught wind in seconds. Then wildfire. Education influencers reposted it. Black journalists elevated it. Hashtags like #NutKaleLearn, Regina was right, and Black Brains Matter trended across platforms. Teachers across the country paused their lessons to show the video. University students discussed it in lecture halls. Talk shows aired it alongside Kale's airport moment. This time, Regina was the face. Her voice, the cry behind the consequence. By the end of the day, over 11 million people had heard her question. By the end of the week, politicians were quoting her in state houses. Even late-night hosts replayed the line, some with tears in their eyes. But what most didn't know was that Regina had been here before. Years earlier, she had been a high school teacher. AP English, North Carolina, loved by her students, respected by parents. But administration rarely supported her when it mattered. She had once called out the systemic favoring of white students in gifted placement, only to find herself mysteriously transferred within months. Another year, she tried to bring in a black poet's work to replace a Hemingway text. Her curriculum was flagged for review. Her evaluations dropped from excellent to needs improvement in one semester. Eventually, she left the classroom, not because she lost her passion, but because the system had made it clear, you don't belong if you challenge the rules. That's why when she saw those men cornering her son under the banner of opportunity, she didn't hesitate. Regina's voice rang not just with pain, but with memory. "I've seen this before," she said during a later interview. This idea that when black kids show exceptional ability, the first instinct is to figure out what's wrong with them, not what's right. That's not oversight. That's oppression. National media latched on. Morning shows invited her for commentary. Online panels trended with discussions about racial profiling in education. Experts weighed in with statistics. Black students were 2.5 times more likely to be referred for behavioral intervention when performing ahead of grade level. One scholar labeled it the excellence tax, the cost paid by black students for daring to succeed in spaces not built for them. But even as love poured in, so did the backlash. Conservative pundits called Regina hysterical. One anchor on a primetime network asked, "Why are we vilifying federal agents for doing their jobs?" A columnist called her an overzealous mother turning her child into a martyr. They combed through her social media, pulling posts from years ago where she criticized the education department. They framed her as radical, untrustworthy, a distraction. Still, Regina didn't flinch. She agreed to a televised town hall, wore the same simple blouse she wore in the viral video. No makeup, no stylist, just presence. She sat across from an anchor who tried to poke holes in her story. "You accuse federal agents of racism, without direct evidence. Isn't that inflammatory?" he asked. Regina leaned forward. "Inflammatory is detaining a child under false pretenses because he solved a math problem better than you expected." "But wasn't it just a conversation?" he pressed. "No, it was a warning disguised as a conversation, and black families have heard that tone for generations." Silence. Applause. The crowd leaned in. She wasn't asking to be liked. She was demanding to be heard. Cale, meanwhile, remained quiet through it all. He declined interviews, turned down offers from private schools and tech investors trying to sponsor his genius. To him, none of it felt honest. He saw how quickly the praise could turn to paranoia. He felt the weight of every stranger projecting their opinions onto his quiet gift. One night, Regina found him sitting on the back porch staring into the dark. "You okay?" she asked. "I don't like being a symbol," he said. "Symbols get broken." Regina sat beside him. "You're not a symbol. You're a storm, and storms don't break. They change things." But even she couldn't have predicted what came next. A former colleague from Regina's teaching days, Miss Tasha Bell, a math teacher from 3 counties over, sent a message through Facebook. "They're building a case against you." Quietly. "Not Cale, you." Regina stared at the screen.
"What kind of case?"
Tasha replied with a screenshot. An anonymous report flagged under an education watchdog blog. The title read, "Is Cale's mother exploiting his gift for fame?" The article accused Regina of coaching Cale to appear smarter online. It claimed she manufactured the Oxford moment by feeding him answers. It questioned her history as a teacher, claimed she had a record of anti-institutional rhetoric. The blog was riddled with errors, but the damage had begun. More anonymous posts followed. Reddit threads appeared. Twitter trolls latched on. Some accused Cale of plagiarism. Others claimed the federal agents had only done their job, and that Regina's response had been a publicity stunt. The same algorithms that once elevated their truth now spread lies. Regina met with a lawyer. Nothing legal had been filed, but she was advised to prepare. People were digging, looking for anything to delegitimize her voice. And her son. That weekend, Cale's face was blurred in a fake video that claimed he had been coached with earpieces. The video racked up nearly 1 million views before it was flagged and taken down. But the comments were already seeded, doubt already planted. Cale didn't say much, but he noticed the stares at school growing more pointed. He noticed the math teacher who once praised him now avoiding eye contact. He noticed the silence stretching longer. One day, on his way out of class, he heard a whisper, "Math puppet." He stopped, didn't turn, didn't flinch, just kept walking. Because he knew. The real lesson wasn't about solving problems. It was about surviving them. Regina watched it all unfold. The praise, the pressure, the pivot, and she realized this was never about just one moment. It was about the world's inability to let black genius breathe without suspicion choking it. So, she wrote. One night Regina published an open letter, part essay, part confession. It was raw, unapologetic, titled "The Cost of Being Brilliant While Black." She didn't hold back. She spoke of her own academic silencing, of watching students be passed over for AP classes because they didn't seem like the type, of Cale's loneliness. His quiet, his brilliance turned into spectacle. His joy turned into burden. The piece went viral within hours. Celebrities shared it, professors assigned it, students printed it. But as it spread, so did the tension. Because somewhere, in the shadows of policy and power, a force was building, one that didn't like being challenged, one that wasn't done with them yet. But for every voice that rallied behind Regina, another powerful force plotted to discredit her and her son. It began as a rumor, a whisper shared between journalists, traded in encrypted threads. At first, no one could confirm it, no one wanted to. But one morning, buried inside a leak from a shuttered policy institute in D.C., the truth surfaced. A single name. Cale Richardson. Not in a news brief, not in a scholarship list, but inside a document stamped internal use only. A 38-page memo titled "Exceptional Cognitive Outliers, Containment and Assessment Recommendations." The document came from the American Equilibrium Initiative, a think tank that branded itself as a bipartisan educational watchdog. But the reality was darker. The initiative, formed 2 decades ago under the umbrella of talent cultivation, was backed by private defense contractors and former intelligence officials. Their real purpose wasn't nurturing gifted youth. It was identifying and controlling those who might disrupt the intellectual status quo. Cale's name appeared on page. He wasn't flagged as a threat. He was listed as an exceptional variable, a term used to describe individuals whose performance significantly outpaces demographic projections and institutional guidance models. The phrase was a bureaucratic mask for something more sinister. He wasn't supposed to be this smart. The memo used coded language, but its intent was unmistakable. It referred to Cale as a non-aligned intellectual emergent, the kind of student who circumvents traditional gatekeeping models. He was someone the system had not cultivated, but who had broken through anyway, and in their eyes, that made him dangerous. The report recommended subtle intervention protocols, increased monitoring of digital activity, outreach under the guise of mentorship, and influence through educational placements that ensured containment through opportunity. The logic was simple. If you can't discredit brilliance, you dilute it, redirect it, own it. When Regina was handed the memo by an investigative reporter, one brave enough to publish through an independent platform, she stared at the pages in silence. The words blurred, not from shock but from familiarity. She had always known. She just never expected to see it confirmed in government language. Cale read it once, then walked away. He didn't want to read it again, not because he didn't understand it, but because he understood it too well. That night, as the house sat in its usual quiet, Regina sat at the kitchen table, the document spread before her like evidence in a courtroom. She called her lawyer, then she called a journalist friend from her teaching days. "If I go public with this," she asked, "what happens to my son?" There was a long pause. Then the voice on the other end said gently, "It depends how loud you're willing to be." She didn't hesitate. Undone whispering. The leak hit the internet on a Thursday. The headline was blunt. Leaked DC memo reveals government watch list of exceptional black youth. The subtitle cut deeper. They're not criminal, they're inconvenient. The article exploded within hours. Cale's name was listed alongside a dozen others. Most were unfamiliar, bright black students from Baltimore, Detroit, rural Texas, each tagged with terms like emergent deviation or cognitive anomaly. The backlash was immediate. Civil rights organizations launched inquiries. Lawmakers demanded hearings. Protests sparked outside think tanks and education offices. But the defenders came just as quickly. Some called the memo fake. Others said it was taken out of context. A spokesperson for the think tank said the language was academic shorthand, misunderstood by the public. One cable news host scoffed. Since when is excellence a problem? But no one addressed the real issue. Why were these children being tracked in the first place? The word containment reappeared in every thread, every headline, every panel discussion. Cale didn't speak to the media. He barely spoke to his friends. But he wrote. He filled notebooks with equations, algorithms, and paradoxes, his way of processing what the world was doing to him. Every line felt like a refusal, a protest in the language he loved. And then, as if pulled from the shadows, a new voice entered the story. A man named Levi Mars. He wasn't a professor, not a politician, not a parent. He was a former analyst, once assigned to a joint task force involving education, intelligence, and predictive analytics. He had seen Cale's file. He stepped forward in a live stream interview, face partially blurred, voice altered. What they're doing, he said, isn't about opportunity. It's about prediction and control. They profile exceptional minority students because they believe unmonitored brilliance is unpredictable and therefore dangerous. He spoke slowly, carefully, as if weighing every word. These aren't school programs, they're surveillance pipelines disguised as scholarships. The interviewer leaned in. You're saying the government is spying on black children. I'm saying they're mapping them, tracking them. And when they can't shape them, they try to erase them. It was the sentence that froze the country. Erase them. The clip went viral within minutes. Hashtags resurfaced. Op-eds poured in. A former federal education official confirmed the task force existed, but said it had been dissolved years ago. But records showed continued funding. Regina received a warning email the next day. No name, no return address. Just 6 words. You're opening doors that stay closed. She read it twice, then deleted it. Because the doors were already open. Cale saw his name trending again. This time, it didn't feel like attention. It felt like evidence that his instincts had always been right. That his invisibility wasn't accidental. It was curated, maintained. His very existence had become a data point in someone else's risk report. That week, a classmate passed him in the hallway and whispered, "Are you like government property now?" The joke wasn't cruel, but it wasn't kind either. Cale didn't answer. He walked past teachers who once praised him, now looking uncomfortable. He noticed his guidance counselor had removed the MIT brochures from her office wall. And then he noticed something else. Half the students whose names were in the leaked memo were no longer in their schools. A news thread followed. Some had transferred suddenly. Some were studying abroad. Some hadn't been seen in weeks. The explanations didn't add up. No media coverage. No goodbye photos. Just disappearance. Regina tried calling one of the mothers. Her number was disconnected. Cale stood in his room that night, staring at the ceiling. He didn't say it out loud, but he knew. They weren't just trying to discredit him now. They were trying to make him vanish. A former agent turned whistleblower stepped forward, claiming Cale's case wasn't isolated. It was part of a pattern. The name Track had never appeared in the public eye. It wasn't a program advertised in school brochures or listed under education department initiatives. It didn't have a logo, a hotline, or even a digital footprint. It existed in silence, until Levi Mars broke it. During his second livestream interview, he leaned into the camera, voice hushed but clear. TRACK stands for Targeted Racial Assessment for Cognition. It was never about help. It was always about control. The footage spread instantly. Unlike past leaks that drowned in white noise, this one struck like lightning. Files followed. Thousands of them. Pages stamped confidential, internal use only, and more chillingly containment protocols. The public barely had time to process what TRACK was before the details spilled out across every major news outlet. According to the documents, TRACK operated under the guise of mentorship programs, elite STEM camps, and specialized academic scholarships, targeting high-performing youth from underrepresented demographics. But its true metric of selection wasn't merit, it was disruption. A grading system called the Variable Risk Index, or VRI, quietly determined who was flagged for deeper surveillance. It scored students based on behaviors like abstract problem-solving, without institutional backing, frequent online anonymity in academic forums, resistance to traditional classroom authority, and self-directed learning, outside of assigned curriculum. Cale had unknowingly ticked every box. His profile read like a blueprint for academic resistance. On the VRI scale, he scored a 9.8 out of 10. The system didn't see him as gifted. It saw him as unpredictable, and therefore a variable that needed to be managed. Maris read from the documents on air, each sentence more revealing than the last. One slide from a track strategy session read, "Unchecked black cognition tends to gravitate toward systemic critique, especially when unshaped by institutional validation. Our goal is to route this intellect toward productivity, not ideology." The words weren't just racist, they were terrifyingly strategic. They weren't afraid of what these children knew, they were afraid of what they might question if no one stopped them. The wave of stories that followed hit like a reckoning. Former track kids, now in their 20s, shared eerie memories of internships that felt more like monitoring stations, camps where they were told to pursue practical careers over creative ones, and mentorships that discouraged political thought under the guise of staying focused. One girl from Georgia recalled being moved to a gifted transfer program in 10th grade and never hearing from her original school again. Another young man from California described being pushed out of a literature track into an engineering-only curriculum despite his protest. He'd once asked his track mentor why, and was told, "You're too sharp with words. That can be dangerous." The revelations reached Regina through a storm of alerts. She and Keel were now caught in something much larger than personal injustice. They were standing inside a systemic fault line, one built to fracture quietly, and then hidden deep in one of the decrypted files. Regina found something she hadn't expected, a second profile, not of Keel, but of herself. It was labeled Subset 4X Genetic Intellectual Heritability Projection, R. Richardson. Her hands trembled as she clicked it open. The file read like a cold autopsy. It detailed her teaching record, flagged moments where she deviated from curriculum, highlighted emails where she challenged administration. It cited her final performance evaluation as non-compliant, and referenced one faculty report that described her as a risk to institutional coherence. But it was one line that stopped her heart. Subject displays socially disruptive cognitive influence with projected heritability amplification in offspring. Regina wasn't just being monitored for activism. Track had marked her as a source, a genetic vector for intellectual nonconformity. They weren't just watching Kale, they had been watching her. She called for Kale. He read the file in silence. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened. For the first time since the airport, Kale looked afraid, but not of them, of what this meant. "They think you're the problem," he said quietly. "Not just me." "No," Regina whispered. "They think we're the blueprint." As the media storm escalated, a deeper wave emerged. The track list wasn't limited to 30 or 40 names. By midweek, over 600 students had been identified, most of them black, many unaccounted for. When the list was made public, Kale scanned it line by line. The majority of the names meant nothing to him, but the annotations did. Some entries were marked with career redirections. Others had red tags, subject unreachable, no further review, and then buried near the bottom was a file without a name. No photo, no date of birth, just the ID. Canned edit null escalated. Unreachable. Under status, formerly under R. Richardson oversight. Risk level high. Status redacted. Kale stared at it for a long time. "That's not me," he said. But it was meant to be. Regina didn't speak. She was already scrolling, already searching, because somewhere in the algorithm, something had gone wrong. Track hadn't just failed to contain Kale. It had lost track of another child, a ghost hidden in the data. A miscalculation, an anomaly. Outside, protest signs were rising across campuses. News anchors debated whether Track was a rogue program or a systemic pattern. But inside their home, the real question echoed between mother and son, heavier than all the headlines. Who was candidate null? Kale's name wasn't the only one on the list. There were hundreds more. But something darker was buried in the next page. The silence between Regina and Kale after finding the file labeled candidate null wasn't empty. It pulsed. Every second stretched into an unspoken question neither could answer. Who was this child? Where were they now? Why was their status marked as redacted when everyone else had a name, a face, a label they could trace? Kale opened the track spreadsheet again, scanning rows not for names but for gaps. He realized something unsettling. The file wasn't consistent. Some IDs skipped sequences. Others had broken metadata, missing school info, blank parent names, blacked out timestamps. It was a digital graveyard. Not all of these students had vanished, but some had, and the system didn't just lose them, it erased them. That night, Regina pulled out her old teacher's laptop. She still had access to a few internal networks she'd once used to monitor statewide student records. It had been years, but her logins worked. She and Kale took shifts combing through names on the track list. Dozens of the students marked as redirected or reassigned didn't show up in graduation rolls. Their social media accounts stopped posting years ago. No college entries. No scholarship acknowledgements. Just silence. One name caught Kale's eye. Darius M. Kimbrough, age 14, Detroit, Michigan. His track tag read, Accelerated Pathway via Global Initiative Program. Departure confirmed. But Kale couldn't find a single photo of Darius after 2019. No mentions in local news. No digital footprint beyond his 8th grade math award. A dead end. Regina sent an inquiry through an old educator. Contact. 2 days later, a reply came back. Darius had been part of an elite scholarship initiatives, supposedly funded by a private European foundation. He was reportedly flown to a boarding school in Switzerland for advanced studies. But there's no address, Regina whispered. No school name. Just the foundation. Kale's jaw clenched. What foundation? The answer. The Arco Novus Institute. A quick search revealed nothing but a basic landing page. No faculty list. No admissions portal. Just a minimalist logo and a form to request information. The domain was registered offshore. The registrar masked. Something didn't sit right. Regina sent the page to a journalist she trusted, asking him to dig deeper. Within hours he responded, This foundation doesn't exist in any European education registry. I think it's a shell. The pieces began to shift. What track called accelerated scholarship programs were smoke screens. Kale and Regina cross-referenced more names. 5 more had identical patterns. Promising students. Quiet disappearances. All under the same language. Gifted relocation. Elite opportunity. Global enrichment. And none of them had returned. One name haunted Regina in particular. Zariah Holloway. A girl she'd briefly mentored through a digital tutoring platform. Bright. Reserved. 12 years old. Obsessed with astrophysics. Regina remembered writing her a glowing recommendation for a space camp she had been scouted for. It had sounded prestigious at the time, but now Zariah's school profile was wiped. Her email bounced. Her photo had been removed from every public school district archive. Regina stared at her old message thread with Zariah. The last message was dated 2 years ago. Miss R, I made it. They say we'll see stars no one's ever seen before. I'm nervous, but I'm ready. She never replied again. Kale closed his laptop. They're not in Switzerland. Regina nodded slowly. They're nowhere. The questions were no longer theoretical. They were urgent. Where were these children being taken? Why was no one asking harder questions? And how far would track or whatever entity had taken its place go to maintain silence? That night, Kale woke to the sound of a soft shuffle outside their apartment door. A slip. A thud. Regina was already awake. She moved quietly toward the door, her hand brushing against the deadbolt. No knock. Just stillness. She opened it cautiously. On the floor lay a single sheet of paper. Typed. No heading. No signature. You're next if you don't stop.
That was it.
Kale stepped beside her, reading over her shoulder. He didn't speak. She didn't blink. The hallway was empty. The neighbors' doors were shut. No cameras in the corridor. Regina picked up the message with tongs from the kitchen. Print it, she told Kale. Then burn it. He nodded. But something shifted in his face. It wasn't fear. It was rage. Controlled. Focused. The kind that doesn't scream but calculates. We can't keep playing defense, he said. We're not, she replied. We're going to expose everything. Kale turned to his whiteboard, erasing equations and replacing them with bullet points. Names, dates, fragments of emails, hyperlinks from Track's internal files. He began to construct a timeline, a map, a data lattice. This wasn't a math problem anymore. This was a pattern hidden in silence, and Kale more than anyone knew how to see patterns no one else could. Whatever this is, he whispered, it's bigger than Track. Someone's still running the machine. Regina placed a hand on his shoulder. Then we find out who, before they find us. An anonymous message slid under their apartment door. You're next if you don't stop. Regina didn't sleep after the note. Neither did Kale, but instead of retreating, they responded with resolve. There was no police report. They didn't trust the system enough to file one. Instead, Regina reached out to every journalist, advocate and former educator who had rallied around their story. The threat confirmed what they already suspected. Someone powerful was watching, and they wanted silence. But silence was never protection. Silence was permission, and Regina had run out of patience for politeness. Within 48 hours, she coordinated a press conference with a coalition of civil rights attorneys and grassroots educators. The venue was symbolic, the gymnasium of Cale's public high school, the place where he had once sat unnoticed, where his brilliance had been buried under low expectations and invisible ceilings. Now it would be the epicenter of a reckoning. The media descended on Raleigh. Vans lined the school parking lot. Satellite dishes rose into the gray sky. National outlets arrived alongside local reporters who had been following the story since it first broke. Protesters gathered outside the gates, holding signs that read, "Let Cale speak," and "Black brilliance is not a threat." A mural of Regina and Cale, painted overnight on the school wall by anonymous artists, was already going viral. It showed Cale holding a math equation in one hand and a torch in the other. Inside, the stage was set with a single podium. No flags, no logos, just truth. Cale stood behind the mic in his signature hoodie, flanked by his mother and a wall of educators in solidarity. He wasn't reading from a script. He wasn't coached. Every word came from the place inside him that had been ignored, diminished, and finally awakened. "They asked me where I learned math," he began, voice clear. "I learned it from silence, from being overlooked, from teachers who didn't call on me, from classrooms that weren't built for me. I learned it because I had to, because numbers were the only place I could be brilliant without interruption." The room held its breath. He paused, then continued, slowly unfolding the math problem from the airport, the same one that launched the firestorm. It had become infamous. Social media dubbed it the Oxford problem. Cale didn't just solve it again, he deconstructed it. "This equation isn't just math," he said. "It's design. It's meant to look complicated, meant to intimidate. But if you understand how it loops, how it disguises simplicity as confusion, you can unravel it. That's what systemic oppression looks like. Complex on the surface, designed to exhaust you, but built from predictable patterns." He turned slightly to the cameras. "They thought I was just solving numbers. I was solving injustice." The words didn't land. They detonated. Twitter lit up within minutes. Solving injustice trended globally. Educators across the country began printing the quote on banners and blackboards. School districts that once pretended not to know Cale's name now begged to be seen acknowledging him. But inside the gym, Cale wasn't finished. "They told me my profile didn't match my performance, that my test scores were anomalies, that my ideas didn't fit the curriculum. What they meant was, I was never supposed to exist in this form, not without their permission." Murmurs moved through the crowd. One reporter whispered to another, "This isn't just a press conference, it's a movement." But just as Cale reached for his closing sentence, the lights flickered. Once. Then again. Then black. The gym was swallowed in sudden darkness. Cameras died. Feed monitors went blank. The projection screens behind Cale flickered once more, then froze. Panic rippled through the audience. Was it a power surge? Sabotage? Protesters inside the room screamed. Some rushed toward the stage. Regina reached instinctively for her son. But then, Cale's mic stayed on. The speakers crackled, but his voice remained crystal clear, untouched by the blackout. It cut through the chaos with eerie clarity. "I guess someone didn't like the math?" Gasps followed. The audio was still streaming. A single tech crew member near the back yelled, "Mic's on a separate circuit." Reporters scrambled to get phones working again. But their signals were jammed. Cameras refused to reboot. The live streams on major networks went dead. All except one. A student in the front row, Kaylin, a quiet sophomore who had always admired Cale from afar, was recording on a device that wasn't connected to the school's Wi-Fi. Her signal held. She posted the raw footage to her backup TikTok account. The video uploaded in real time. Within minutes, it had 10,000 views, then 50, then 500,000. Because while the world scrambled for clarity, Cale kept speaking. "Black genius scares people," he said, eyes steady in the semi-darkness. "Not because it's rare, but because it refuses to stay small." Then he looked into the crowd, not for applause, but to deliver the final blow. "You can't erase people just because your data can't explain them." Suddenly, one of the side doors to the gym burst open. A woman ran in, holding a flash drive in her fist, face red with adrenaline. She made a beeline for Regina, whispering urgently into her ear. Regina's face went pale. She nodded once. Then she turned to Keel, barely mouthing the words, "It's bigger than we thought." Moments later, the live feed was cut by a sudden blackout. Only Keel's mic still worked. The blackout wasn't an accident. It was a message. The gym's lights failed, the live stream feeds dropped, and every network camera went dark, all within the same 5-second window. Panic rippled through the press conference, but what no one expected was that Kale's voice kept broadcasting, clear, uninterrupted. Defiant. Maya Thompson, a quiet 17-year-old senior, wasn't known for speeches or protests. She was known for code, for backdoor servers and scrapped routers, and when the blackout struck, she was ready. That morning, she'd connected Kale's mic line to an independent VPN server she'd custom built under her desk, using a hacked Raspberry Pi. She rerouted the signal to a peer-to-peer live streaming site she managed under the alias Nullbyte. No moderators, no monetization, no central shutdown switch. When the school's main systems were wiped offline, Maya's backup kicked in, and Kale's words kept moving. Millions found the backup stream within minutes. The link spread across Twitter, Discord, Telegram, even YouTube re-uploads. By the time Kale finished his final line, "You can't erase people just because your data can't explain them," more than 9 million viewers were watching live. The stream was dubbed "the mic that shouted back," and within an hour it had become a global phenomenon. As the gym buzzed in chaos and confusion, a woman pushed through the side doors clutching a flash drive. Her name was Elaine Reyes, a former track contractor who had kept silent for years, but that night, she handed Regina the drive and whispered, "This has everything: transfers, facility names, experiments, children." Regina froze, then slipped the drive into her coat. The stage had already become a battleground of truth. Now they held the receipts. By the time Kale and Regina returned home, hashtags like "Trackdown" and "Kale Speaks" had clogged every trending list. Civil rights lawyers were offering pro bono support. School districts issued vague statements. But the pressure was real. Track's collapse wasn't a matter of if, it was when. Still, for Kale, none of it felt like a win. In his room, he sat quietly while Maya decrypted the files on the flash drive. Her message came in at midnight. "Got it open. It's way bigger. Private labs, universities, child reassignments, government grants, all tied to one directive: cognitive containment." Kale read the lines again and again. It wasn't about education. It was about ownership. Licensing intellect. Tagging it. Regulating it. Like property. But they weren't the only ones reading. Across the country, in a secure windowless conference room, a closed-door interagency panel was convening. The conversation was brief. The conclusions brutal. Kale Richardson was no longer a student or a public figure. He was, in the words of the file, an unstable intellectual asset posing high predictive risk. The panel didn't vote. They signed. At 3:03 a.m., a federal warrant was issued. Its language was sterile, subject to be extracted for protective detainment under national cognitive threat protocols. It didn't say arrest. It didn't say trial. It said containment. Regina and Kale had no idea. Back home, Kale scrolled through reactions to his speech. He watched teenagers in Philadelphia holding up signs that read, "We are variables too." A group of 6th graders in Texas had painted "Solve Us" on the steps of their middle school. A math professor at Howard released a tribute calling Kale's metaphor the most important educational protest of the decade. And then came the knock. 3 sharp, controlled taps at the door. Not rushed. Not casual. Cold. Professional. Regina, still dressed, moved toward the peephole. 2 men in plain suits stood outside. One held a folder. The other stood empty-handed, eyes locked on the door. A 4th knock followed, slower, more deliberate. Regina looked through the peephole again. One of the men raised the folder just enough to show the word "Warrant" printed across the top. Kale stepped into the hallway. His eyes met his mother's. They didn't speak. A legal warrant had just been signed to remove Kale from his home for questioning. The night was silent when the black SUVs rolled up. The headlights cut through the darkness like blades. It was 3:12 a.m. inside the mostly empty street where the Richardsons' apartment building stood. Regina jolted awake the moment she heard tires crunch on gravel. She didn't hesitate. She had anticipated this moment ever since she saw the warrant, ever since she knew they were coming. She grabbed her phone, flicked on the small ring light she kept by the nightstand, and hit live. The soft glow from the phone illuminated her face, calm, resolute, ready. The doorbell rang once, then again, not a friendly chime, a hard mechanical buzz. Regina held her breath. Cale stirred beside her, still groggy from sleep. He sat up slowly, eyes widening. "Mom," he whispered. She didn't answer. The live stream was already capturing everything. Downstairs, men in unmarked jackets moved in formation. No sirens, no attempt at subtlety. They used keys, master keys, she assumed, because the deadbolt turned slowly, almost ceremoniously. The door creaked open. Two figures stood there, silhouetted against the dim hallway light, one holding a folder stamped "Warrant," the other holding nothing, arms at his side. Footsteps echoed in the hall. Inside the apartment, Regina's phone recorded every motion. She didn't hide it. The camera tracked their entry. The taller man's face flickered under the overhead light. As he stepped in, the second followed. His eyes flicked toward the phone. She held it visibly, angle low, capturing the entire room. The taller man cleared his throat. His voice was low, calm, but heavy. "Mrs. Richardson, Mr. Richardson," he said, pausing as his gaze landed on Cale. "We are executing a protective detainment order. For questioning, you are both to remain calm." Cale stood slowly, hands raised. Regina's thumb hovered over the live button. She didn't turn it off. Not now. Not ever. As the agents moved forward, another burst of sound came from outside. A woman's yell. Distant but urgent. Then chanting. Behind the closed windows of nearby apartments, faint lights flickered away. Within seconds, the hallway outside the front door grew noisy with people. Neighbors stepping out, phones in hands, flashlights waving. The glow of screens brightening the dark. In the living room, the agents hesitated. The taller one glanced toward the window. A sound outside, maybe, or a silhouette pacing across the hallway. Regina didn't move. She didn't hide. She simply stood in front of her son and looked the men dead in the eye. "Do your worst," she said. "Because I'm watching." One of the agents reached for Cale. The other began to pivot toward Regina. But then the hallway erupted. Voices, shouts, the sound of car horns, heavy footsteps. In the sudden chaos, the agent at Cale froze. He took a step back. At that moment, the live stream count soared. 4 million viewers. Notifications exploded across the screen. Alert live, Richardson home raid. Raid, free Cale trending. Black Mom Records raid. Outside the door, people from the building had gathered. Some in pajamas, some holding blankets. A few banged on neighboring doors, urging others to come outside. One man shot a shaky video with his phone. Another dialed a number. Light spilled into the hallway, and with it, voices. The agents exchanged glances. The folder stamped "Warrant" crinkled in the taller man's hand. He looked at his partner. No one spoke. Then he quietly closed the folder and stepped back. "You're under surveillance," he said quietly to Regina, but loud enough for the phone to catch. "Any further interference will be judged inappropriate resistance." Without a second look, both men turned and walked out, as calmly as they had entered. The door clicked shut behind them. Silence. Regina lowered her phone. The screen glowed dimly, with red tail live lettering. The viewer count still climbing. She exhaled slowly. Cale remained frozen in the center of the room. Eyes damp, but defiant. "Mom," he said softly. "Thank you." She nodded. They expected fear. Her voice was steady. Instead, they got witnesses. By dawn, the apartment was filled with sound. Not sirens, but noise that carried a power no force could suppress. Notifications pinged endlessly. Journalists calling. Allies sending messages. Support pouring in from strangers who had seen the raid online. On social media, protest hashtags exploded. "Free Cale," "Black Brilliance under attack." "They tried to silence us." "Math is not a sin." Across the country, groups organized solidarity vigils. In Philadelphia, hundreds of students sat in math classes with signs reading, "Variables not vulnerable." In Chicago, a church held a candlelight vigil, titled "Light Up the Night for Black Minds." Everywhere, people replayed the live stream, screenshot after screenshot, each click another bulwark against the darkness someone tried to impose. By midday, advocates had drafted a petition demanding the dismantling of the covert program known as TRACK, Targeted Racial Assessment for Cognition. calling it unconstitutional and racist. The petition gained thousands of signatures every minute. Civil rights lawyers offered free representation. Educational forums erupted in heated debates. News outlets that had once speculated now reported with urgency. The pressure was real. The world had seen. And it refused to look away. But inside the movement, there was fear beneath the outrage. Regina and Cale were not anonymous anymore. Their faces were everywhere. So were the faces of those 600-plus students. Some parents began reaching out privately, afraid for their children. Many urged secrecy. Some considered moving. Jobs were left behind. Schools were transferred. Some families vanished overnight. The same pattern that had swallowed other names in the files flickered again. Disappearances. Silent relocations. Lost hope. Regina looked at her phone. A message from an unknown number. They've back-channeled jurisdiction now. They don't care about what you proved. They care about control. Cale tapped on another alert. A doctored video had surfaced. The private one filmed before the raid, showing a family in suburban Ohio. The little boy inside the video looked eerily like him, at age 14. Caption read, "Another student they removed. Just for being different." It had thousands of views already. The goal was clear: fear, confusion, dismissal, diversion. Regina clenched her jaw. She opened the live stream app. The number had crossed 4.2 million. Comments scrolled. "We are watching. Don't hide. We stand with you." Then at 2:17 p.m., the world froze. On every major network, every streaming platform, every news feed, one message appeared simultaneously. Breaking: former Oxford professor issues statement regarding Cale Richardson. Details at 3 p.m. ET. People paused. Phones stopped. Live streams froze into thumbnails. The social feeds quieted for seconds. A collective hold. Regina glanced at Cale. He stared back. Neither spoke. Because they both knew. Whatever came next would change everything. As protests erupted, Alistair Grange issued a public statement, but it wasn't what anyone expected. The day started like any other. Yet by noon the world held its breath. News outlets across the globe had scheduled a live press conference. University of Oxford, represented by its eminent mathematician Alistair Grange, would speak publicly for the first time since the scandal erupted. The cameras gathered in a formal hall, rows of microphones, lined up like silent sentinels. Reporters cleared their throats. Some exchanged uneasy glances. Students held their breath. Parents checked phones. The air tingled with anticipation, suspicion, hope. Alistair walked onto the stage, under bright lights. His posture immaculate, his suit pristine, his face calm. For a moment he surveyed the room. Then he exhaled, and everything changed. His voice was measured, controlled, but faint tremors betrayed the weight of what he was about to do. "Good afternoon," he began. "I stand before you today not as a victim of outrage, but as someone who underestimated not just a student, but the power of silence, of assumptions, of expectations." He paused, letting the silence settle. Cameras clicked. Reporters leaned forward. The world waited. He unbuttoned his jacket, removed his tie, and for the first time appeared vulnerable. "When I presented that problem to Mr. Cale Richardson at the airport," he said quietly, "I intended to assert a difference. To remind a spectator why elite intellect belongs in certain institutions. I believed that the challenge would end the moment his pencil stopped writing. I believed I was safe in my assumption." The audience shifted uncomfortably. Phones recorded. Eyes widened. "But I was wrong," Alistair continued. "Very wrong." He raised a single sheet of paper. The same problem. The one Cale solved in 20 seconds. This problem, he said, had remained unsolved by any undergraduate at Oxford for 5 years. PhD candidates stumbled. Postgraduate scholars debated. It became a benchmark of our difficulty, until Cale solved it. A collective gasp rippled. Reporters murmured. Some pressed record again. Others exchanged disbelief. Alistair's eyes cooled. I did not challenge him for curiosity. I challenged him to prove a theory. My theory that brilliance could only exist inside pedigree, legacy, institutional grooming. His confession cracked through walls of academic coldness and exposed something uglier, a bias deeply rooted, a gatekeeping mentality cloaked in prestige. He swallowed, then delivered the blow no one expected. But more than that, Alistair said, voice heavier now. I must admit something else. I am not alone. Oxford, My department has been collaborating with external organizations in the United States for what some call educational outreach. Others call it youth intelligence harvesting. I provided data test scores, performance evaluations, demographic profiles of select students to a covert program known as TRACK. I believed then we were helping underprivileged talent find opportunity. I believed in mentorship, in access. He lowered the sheet, but I see now how it was misused. How brilliance like Kale's becomes a variable, a data point, a possession to be tracked, redirected, contained, exploited. The room erupted. Shouts. Some people crying, others stunned into silence. Reporters shouted questions. Why? Did you know what they would do? Do you regret it? Alistair stood still, his gaze locked on the camera. Yes, he said simply. I regret that I added his name to a list instead of teaching him respect. In that moment, his confession cracked open the veneer of prestige. The institution trembled. Alumni released statements. Students walked out of tutorials. Faculty dissociated. The word institutional racism resurfaced in academic journals overnight. Headlines blazed across continents. Oxford's greatest shame. When prestige betrays humanity. TRACK exposed from universities to underground labs. But the twist landed hardest on the community that had rallied behind Kale. A former classmate of Kale's, quiet, unseen, unnoticed, stepped forward during the press scrum. Her name was Maya Thompson. She had built the livestream backup code that saved Kale's voice. Under pressure, she had also secretly downloaded the full list of names TRACK had circulated, over 600 young minds like Kale's. She held up her phone. On screen scrolled dozens of names, photos, ages, city, and under each, a status column, redirected, overseas placement, unreachable. Then she added more. Emails, contracts, confidential letters from private labs, agreements with biotech firms. She said quietly, they weren't just redirecting students. They were turning them into experiments. Human capital under optimization trials, programs for cognitive enhancement and extraction. Intelligence was being harvested and monetized. The camera zoomed on her face. Her eyes were fierce, alive. We haven't found all the children yet, she said. But we have the trail, the records, and now the world does too. The crowd erupted again. Reporters shouted questions. Lawyers scribbled. Phones buzzed. A few people wept. Others cheered. But over all the noise hung a heavy realization. This was bigger than Kale. Bigger than protest. This was a reckoning. Alistair stepped back. Tears glimmered in his eyes. I am ashamed, he said again. For every name I added. For every file I forwarded. For every brilliance I boxed in a spreadsheet. I did not see people. I saw data. And I failed. He folded his hands. Quiet. Broken. As he turned to leave the podium, a group of former TRACK analysts walked forward. One by one they held up blank sheets. Empty attachments. Then they spoke. We destroy data. We erase traces. We hide the children. We call it security. Their voices harsh, collective. The crowd gasped. Alistair's face paled. He turned back to the mic. They're lying. He slammed his palm on the podium. I don't know where they are. I never authorized it. I don't know who did, but I will help find them. Start again. His admission hung in the air like a promise or a warning. Across the stadium of media. Across campuses listening in. Across millions watching at home. People began to cry. Rage. Grief. Determination. But in the roar, one question echoed louder than all. Where are the missing children? Behind him, on a small side table, the press team had placed the folder with Kale's solved problem. It lay face up, white page, black ink, neat handwriting. Under bright lights, it looked like proof, redemption, danger. As the cameras cut, and the live broadcast ended, Alistair lifted his suit jacket and placed his passport on the podium. With trembling fingers, he closed his laptop. He stepped away from the lights and walked out of the hall. Up the stairs, down the corridor, into a waiting car. Engine idled. He glanced over his shoulder at the press gates, then looked ahead. A flight awaited. To Washington, D.C., to testify before Congress, to speak truth under oath, to decide his fate, and perhaps the fate of thousands. With the world watching, Oxford distanced itself. But Alistair was already boarding a flight to testify before Congress. They came from all sides. Reporters, lawmakers, educators, parents, activists. The congressional hearings convened in a grand hearing room in Washington, D.C. Bright lights, microphones, cameras, a packed gallery. More than a dozen former participants in track sat together at the witness table. Lawyers and civil rights advocates lined the benches. On the dais, senators and representatives shuffled folders, clearing throats, making notes. The nation watched as accusations became evidence, and rumors became testimony. At the center of it all stood Alistair Grange, looking thinner, older, more human than the polished figure who once wore Oxford's prestige like armor. He repeated his confession from the press hall. He laid out documents. He read confirmation of contracts, funding lines, data pipelines from Oxford and international universities to track. Every time a new page slid across the table, the click was like a gavel hitting injustice. Then came the most wrenching moment. A testimony from a former track-identified student, a young woman named Aria Jackson. She described how at age 15 she was quietly pulled from her public school under the guise of advanced academic placement, only to be transported across state lines and placed in a private experimental lab. She was told it was for enhanced cognitive development, but what she found instead was isolation, forced routines, and constant evaluations. Her voice cracked as she spoke. "They didn't want me to succeed. They wanted me to disappear." The room went silent. Cameras held. Viewers at home paused. Some turned away. One by one, others spoke. Quiet, smart kids from Detroit, Atlanta, Chicago, Memphis, with stories like hers, lost academic records, no graduation photo, no transcript, no public trace. Each name an echo of erased possibility. By the close of the hearings, the verdict was clear and swift. Track was dismantled. All involved institutions severed ties, funding lines frozen, internal contracts nullified. A public apology was issued by several universities, including Oxford. Committees were formed to audit past data practices, safeguard academic youth rights, and attempt reparations. On paper it was a victory. On hearts it was messy. For Cale Richardson, the aftermath was bittersweet. Offers came from top universities around the world. Full scholarships, honors tracks, invitations to exclusive research programs. His mailbox overflowed. But each offer felt tainted. Invitations to a system that had once tried to own him. Instead, he made a decision. He would stay in America. He would build something different, something that couldn't be controlled or co-opted. He called it Proof, a national mentorship network for Black youth gifted in mathematics and science. In his childhood bedroom, once crammed with whiteboards and silent equations, Cale and Regina set up their first proof planning session. Paper charts, contact lists, funding proposals, volunteer rosters lined the wall. The goal was simple: to create safe spaces where brilliance could breathe without suspicion or prejudice, not to prove a point, but to nurture a future. The movement sparked. High schoolers across the country wrote to Proof asking for mentorship. College students volunteered as guides. Teachers who once ignored Cale's potential now offered classrooms, an after-school program. Communities that never expected a Black kid in calculus began hosting algebra nights, math circles, tutoring sessions. Pride swelled where invisibility once ruled. Still, none of that erased what had occurred. At night, Cale lay awake, haunted by the memory of the raid, the surveillance, the silent emptiness of missing kids. He couldn't forget the faces in the leaked files, the girls and boys who disappeared under the guise of opportunity. Yet he also believed that Proof could change something, change what American brilliance looked like. Not lineage, not privilege, not data points, but heart, curiosity, persistence, talent nurtured, not controlled. On the day he accepted the invitation to deliver a keynote at a major TEDx event, the world felt different. The auditorium was packed. Lights dimmed. The stage glowed with possibility. Cale walked on, calm but determined. The audience, dozens of students, educators, activists, supporters sat forward. Cameras rolled. He began softly. "When I was 16, a professor from Oxford handed me a piece of paper. A problem. He thought it would humiliate me. Instead, I solved it. Not to prove him wrong, but to prove something far bigger. That brilliance can't be contained in boxes, built for other people." He paused. For the viewers, for the kids watching from home, for every student who had been told they didn't fit. The screen behind him remained blank. Then it lit up. A simple equation, one of his own. Clean, elegant, A challenge to whoever thought intelligence could be silenced. Suddenly, a hand rose in the crowd. Slow, deliberate. Holding another folded piece of paper. The kind professors use for homework assignments. The kind designed to break students. The kind meant to test. He didn't know who it was. A supporter? A skeptic? A trap? But in that moment, the auditorium held its breath. And so did Cale. As Cale took the TEDx stage for his first keynote, a hand in the crowd rose, holding another folded paper with a problem. The auditorium was silent when the folded paper passed through the air. Time slowed. The lights overhead seemed too bright, too exposing. Cale Richardson stood still on the TEDx stage, the spotlight engraving his quiet figure against the dark backdrop. A single hand rose among the crowd, anonymous, calm, deliberate, holding a crisp sheet of paper. Not a note card, not a cue card, a full problem, dense, illegible at a glance, wrapped in the same ominous promise that once sought to define him. For a moment, Cale's eyes flitted downward. The hush in the audience was so deep it felt physical, like heavy air pressing against lungs. Cameras zoomed, spectators leaned forward. Breaths were held. The problem looked like a challenge, maybe even a trap. In that moment, every expectation lined up. The crowd expected him to take it, solve it, prove once again that brilliance lived inside him. They expected fireworks. They expected vindication. Cale took a step forward, then another. He closed the small distance, reached out, but not to accept. Instead, he extended a fist. The paper dropped from the hand, fluttering. Then he turned. Every eye followed. The silence stretched. When he spoke, his voice was calm. "Thank you," he said softly, "but I cannot solve this." Gasps ran through the room. A few shouted. Some stood. The paper lay at his feet. Cale looked down at it for a long moment. Then without a word he walked off the stage. Not in defeat. In decision. He stepped off the closest platform. The applause didn't come. Instead, a stunned quiet, like stepping off a cliff and waiting for the ground to catch you. No cheers. No condemnation. Just frozen shock. Backstage, in the dim light, Cale met his mother's eyes. Her face was pale. Concern etched deep. She opened her mouth, then closed it. He shook his head. Some problems aren't meant to be solved by one mind. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't surrender. It was refusal. A refusal to treat human brilliance like a test. A refusal to frame worth as a single answer. A refusal to play by rules written by those who always assumed the answers belonged to them. He didn't look back. That night, news outlets buzzed. The moment became a viral shock. Teen genius walks out on final test. Black prodigy says some problems require community. When solving isn't enough. Social media erupted. Some called it cowardice. Others reverence. Many were confused. A few angry. But most were silent. Processing. Questioning. Reflecting. Because Cale had done something no equation could capture. He had rejected the idea that brilliance was a solo path. He had shown that the hardest problems, those of identity, inequality, justice, weren't meant for a single mind to solve. The next morning, press vans gathered in front of the venue. Reporters knocked on the backstage door. Producers called. Every major outlet demanded interviews. But the door remained shut. No replies, no statements, just emptiness. Rumors spread. Was Cal leaving? Was he disillusioned? Was he scared? Or was this his final answer? He didn't post. He didn't call. He didn't respond. For years he disappeared from public view. No social media updates. No academic announcements. No public speeches. His phone went dark. His email closed. For some he became legend. For others a ghost. But for those who mattered, those who believed brilliance belonged to more than lineage or privilege, he had become a symbol. Behind the scenes, seeds he had planted began to grow. The network he founded, Proof, quietly blossomed, in cities from Atlanta to Seattle, from Detroit to New Orleans. Small study groups started forming. Volunteers shared resources. Teachers from underfunded schools offered classrooms after hours. Kids who once hid their love for math now scribbled equations on chalkboards under the Proof banner. Not for fame, not for approval, but for possibility, for community, for recognition that genius could live anywhere, and that sometimes it took more than one mind to solve the hardest problem. Whispers of Cale used to reach young students in cramped apartments, in crowded classrooms, in neighborhoods told they weren't meant to be smart. Now they had a name, not an idol, but a movement, a network, a home. Years passed. Proof chapters multiplied. Math nights, coding sessions, mentorship circles, scholarship funds, emotional support. A place where brilliance wasn't suspicion. It was nurtured, celebrated, shared. But the rumors never faded. Some said Cale was traveling the world, laying low under another name. Others said he was inside a lab somewhere, watched, studied, contained. Still more whispered that he had been silenced for good. None of them mattered, because the message lived on. In a cramped community center in Detroit, high schoolers whispered to each other, "One day we'll solve not just math, we'll solve this world." In a dilapidated school in Houston, a teacher erased the word impossible from the blackboard and replaced it with yet. In a living room in Memphis, a young girl traced chalk lines over her notebook and wrote, "Brilliance belongs to all." Cale's name wasn't anywhere. But every time a student lifted a pencil to tackle a problem, especially one that no one said they could solve, his legacy flickered quietly, like a candle lighting the dark. Because some problems aren't meant to be solved by one mind. They're meant to be shared, multiplied, carried forward. In the silence that followed his departure, an envelope arrives at Regina's old teaching address, stamped priority mail. No return name, inside a single equation, never seen before, and a note, this time, bring the whole class. No child should have to prove their worth just to be treated with dignity. No parent should have to live stream justice to keep their child safe. If this story moved you, if you believe silence is complicity, type yes. If you believe in justice,